Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and I'm continuing with my series here on wordplay in John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphia, or Hieroglyphic Monad. I'm using the translation Dr. Nancy Turner and I did in 2021 from Ouroboros Press. And what I'm going to talk about today is, I hope, of interest to you who are interested also in this, John Dee's Enochian corpus, or his spirit diaries. Why is that? Well, let me share my screen here and we'll talk about it. Okay, the word that I'm talking about today is this one, Gamaeaa. He says in the Hieroglyphic Monad, in the letter to Maximillian, that he explained this in his lectures to students in Paris, which would have been in the early 1550s, as Gamos Gaian, the earth of marriage, or as the terrestrial seal of this conjugal influence. He's talking about a magical seal, the monad symbol itself as a magical seal. So that's important. But also those of you who have worked with, say, the Great Table of Earth know that it's often divided into 4 watchtowers based on a structure Edward Kelly finds, and this is associated with the structure in the book of Revelation, the part of the Bible other than Genesis Dee is most fascinated by. And you break it, these watchtowers then, into take the earth tablet, which is already earth of the great table of earth, notice. Then you have earth of air, earth of water, earth of fire. Well, here he says he's talking about the earth of marriage. Wait a minute. That's not an element, is it? A classical element? Well, think of one of the big contexts here. One of the big contexts is the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. So the conjugal influence, what is it there? Well, the coupling of the sun and moon to bring about the operation of the sun, which is gold, and that is the work of the alchemist. I've also pointed out in other videos that we're not talking about physical alchemy here. This is more a type of, well, it is a type of philosophical alchemy. So first of all, recognize that Dee either creates this word or he recreates it. Now, the last scholarly translator, Joosten, thought he created it. So did I when I started. Since then, some scholars at the University of Amsterdam have noted that Paracelsus uses it. That would make sense because Paracelsus was coming back in vogue. Paracelsian medicine was coming back in vogue in the early 1550s when Dee was giving these lectures in Paris. That he's where he says he defined this term. So it could be the same word used, but he's giving it a totally different meaning, which is probably why he re-explains it. Some scholars have suggested very plausibly that it comes from a Hebrew word, the Hebrew word for talisman or an amulet or a cameo. This one here, Kof, Mem, Yod, Zadi. Although, to be fair, these same scholars then undercut themselves by saying Dee didn't know a lot about Hebrew and didn't know the Sefer Yetzirah or the Zohar, which I find, if he didn't, then somehow he just recreated the same thing. And while I think Dee was a brilliant man, I don't think he was brilliant enough to come up with the Sefer Yetzirah. But yeah, that's just my take on it. Your mileage may vary, as they say. So let's go with this idea that he's using a Latin version of a word that comes from Hebrew that means talisman, because in fact he's saying he's using it as a kind of talisman, a magical seal. Gamos Gaian, earth of marriage, the terrestrial seal of this conjugal influence. I would say the conjugal influence of the sun and moon in the emerald tablet. So we won't totally understand what he means by that quality until we get to theorems 20 and 21. Links to my class on the hieroglyphic monad are below. But in theorem 20, we get his notions of squaring of the circle. I will talk about that in the very next slide here. And that's also his sort of mystical hypercube, and where we see Dee's three-dimensional version of something we hear about from everyone from Nicholas of Cusa to Aleister Crowley. That is the idea of a circle has something whose center can be everywhere, and the circumference is nowhere. It's actually, we could re-understand that as a hypersphere, but I'm getting way ahead. Okay, theorem 21 will be all about how you can restore nature by taking the monad apart, flipping it around, putting it back together, and resurrecting it, kind of like a golem in an alchemy lab. And indeed, you can think of his monad symbol as a kind of golem. There's a great scholarly article about that. I'll put a link to it below too. But there's also some links in that theorem to Plato Timaeus. But we can understand the puns now. And one thing that is important is that later, when he's talking about this concept in the theorems, he doesn't use the word again. He assumes you know it in this letter. And most people totally miss that because it's common to not read the letter. It wasn't translated by, say, Hamilton Jones and so on. All right, so let's take a look. D puns on Gamaeaa, which is a magic square, comes from the same root, some people say, as Gamaeaa. Then on Gaian, the Greek primordial goddess. So he's inventing this usage of the word. I put Durer's Melancholia here just because Durer is a big influence on Dee. Dame Frances Yates points out the influence that Durer is upon all of Renaissance Hermeticism. He comes a generation before Dee, but here in his famous painting Melancholia, we see a magic square. That's a square where you add up every row or column, it adds up to the same thing. This is an order 4, meaning there's 4 numbers, and the magic sum here is 34. It's a square. Remember, the hieroglyphic monad has this circle, usually associated with the sun, gold, or Tifereth, as its head. So if the monad seems to have a circle, here's a square. Illusion, the squaring of the circle, something I have a later video on. So it was not until this century that mathematicians showed how that the numbers in any mathematical magic square were geometric. So down here, excuse me, you have one of Lee Sallow's geometric magic squares, where the shape of each side creates the same thing all the way around. So John Dee would be very pleased with this work of Lee Sallow, I might guess. Sallow says all magic squares are geometric. Anyway, but Dee is using this word, Gamaeaa, to get back to that, to describe a particular quality of his monad. And I've already talked about theorem 20 in the squaring of the circle in the last one. He also is going to talk about it in 21. So Gamaeaa is one of the puns. Now, Gaia. Most of you know who Gaia is if you're interested in this topic. Gaia is the ancient Greek personification of Earth, the mother goddess. Gaia and Uranus, who to the Romans becomes Aeon, birthed the Titans, and in effect, most of Greek mythology. Here's a picture of a Roman mosaic that I grabbed from Wikipedia, so I could have an illustration here. So this is Uranus as in the Roman depiction as Ion, Gaia, and some of their Titanic kids. All right, Dee says, again, Gamos Gaian, the earth of marriage, or the terrestrial seal of the conjugal influence. So he's telling you, this is a magical seal, and it is imbued with the qualities of what the sun and moon create conjugally in the emerald tablet. That's pretty impressive, right? Because what does the emerald tablet create? Life. And hence the idea of the hieroglyphic monad as a sort of golem. You may be familiar with Dee's later seal, the seal of Ameth, or seal of truth of God, or Sigillin D Ameth. There's one stylized version. The reason I put this up is it's easier to see here, perhaps. This is complicated, but if you stare at it, sometimes it will seem to take on a depth as if you're looking down into this, or sometimes looking up at it. So think of that circle of the hieroglyphic monad as something that you can flip into a sphere. That's something very important to do with Dee. Now, let me give you the whole quote from his letter to King Maximillian. He says, this, our hieroglyphic monad, possesses a certain latent terrestrial body in the center of its center. Okay, that would be here. What? There's supposed to be a little dot there. Remember the last picture? Usually there's a dot here. Why has it disappeared? Well, he's going to tell you, in a way, a certain latent terrestrial body in the center of its center. One would think that would either be here, or I guess it could be here, because this is a place where he will have the 4 lines separate in a later theorem, or it could be both. And as we will see when we get to that theorem, it will be, but I'm getting ahead again. So Then he will say by what divine power that body should be actuated. It will be coupled in perpetual marriage with the gonetic influence of the sun and moon. So this is going to couple with the sun and moon, which are coupling. And here is a word that I just made up in English because Dee made up a word in Latin from this Greek word, gonos, from sperm, seed, offspring. And so he gets gonetica by adding etica on there. So I called it gonetic. It's the sperm-like influence of the sun and moon. Why would he say that? Well, it's a common trope in Renaissance alchemy. The idea of the dew even being like the sperm of the heavens. You get in Midsummer Night's Dream the line of dewing the orbs, D-E-W, not D-O. You get in one of Dee's later scryer Edward Kelly's poems, he rhymes spermies with Hermes. It's kind of a thing. Seems strange now, but it's not unusual then. So it will be coupled with the genetic influence of the sun and moon when it is so actuated. Even if these bodies had existed elsewhere, most separately, they'll be in the same place in the sky. Wow, what are we getting here? It sounds kind of like quantum entanglement if you're in the 21st century. Is it the same kind of thing then? Well, the metaphor would certainly match. So now what do you usually get if the sun and moon are in the same place, by the way? You get an eclipse. I mean, that's what the sun and moon in the same place is. But if he is talking about the qualities of the sun and moon, he could be talking about anything from silver and gold, Yesod merging with Tifereth. This assumes, of course, that he's using the Kircher tree and knows the Sefer Yetzirah. In fact, if you don't assume that, you can't explain the hieroglyphic monad. That's one way we know that he knew the Sefer Yetzirah. Yes, I am sort of frustrated with scholars who can't understand the monad, but then they insist he didn't know the Sefer Yetzirah. Okay, so he says, here by God's will produced this Gamaeaa, a word that to the Parisians I interpreted as Gamos, Gaian, the earth of marriage, or the terrestrial seal of this conjugal influence, can no longer be fed and watered in its native earth until the fourth great and truly metaphysical revolution be completed. That finite progress being made, he who has fed metamorphosizes. First, he will go away. That's what has happened to this dot here. Then after will most rarely be seen by mortal eyes. Now, is Dee talking about someone who ascends? Or, well, you can decide when we get to that point. What is this fourth great and truly metaphysical revolution? Dee is very interested in processional astrology, the astrology of great world ages. And that's one of the things also that he will draw on from Plato's Timaeus. Timaeus will say in this famous dialogue that there were all of these cycles and cycles within cycles, but at some unknown time in the future, all of the cycles will line up. And then that is the return of the golden age, the great and truly metaphysical revolution cycle has been completed. Okay, so consider a few things about Gamaeaa, and then I will refer back to this when I get to my videos on theorems 20 and 21, but especially 20 actually. The sun and the moon and the emerald tablet are coupling with the monad. They now have the power of that total union, which we'd usually think of as an eclipse, but even if one is not now eclipsing each other, they'll have that power, and that is the power in the emerald tablet that creates the operation of the sun. The fourth revolution is both the lining up of cycles from the Timaeus and the apocalypse of Revelation in Dee's Neoplatonic apocalyptic theology. That's what it is in one sense, but in another, if we think of the center of the monad as being this dot that's not there, or this circle, the point where, the center of this circle, or where these points cross, and we'll find that point being displaced in theorem 20. The center of the center in the monad is something else. Oh, and what do you get when you displace the center here? Those of you in initiatory orders based on the Kabbalah, like all the Golden Dawn spinoffs, you get a pentagram. you get the same pentagram that you use in your rituals. By the way, the main source and the only source of that I find is John Dee, and you can find that in the Hieroglyphic Monad and in his spirit diaries. And I will talk about that as a later time. But if you went through, say, your portal ritual, there's a place where the cross of the elements, this place, is connected with a crowning point of spirit, and somehow you get a magical pentagram. That's right from the Hieroglyphic Monad. Okay, so just as a review, the sun and the moon and the emerald tablet are coupling with the monad. They now have the power of total union, even if one is not now eclipsing the other. The fourth revelation is the completion of cycles from Timaeus in one sense, but in another, if you think of the center of the monad, you get something else. In fact, this is the place where Dee will stumble onto the concept of higher dimensions he has no word for. The center of the center, it's where the inside becomes the outside. So if you think of the emerald tablet as above and below, you'll then get as within, so without. It's pretty cool. And to remind you again, Earth of Marriage, among other things, he's alluding to the concept of an elementata. I've got another video on that, see below. And because usually, like with the Enochian work, you would have earth of something. Earth of earth, earth of fire, earth of water. Here we get earth of marriage, but it's the marriage of the emerald tablet. So basically you have earth of all the elements. The center of the center is where the inside becomes the outside. And I got to tell you, I think that is pretty awesome. So that's why I've spent all of this time telling you about what Dee means by a Gamaeaa. Okay, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.